Paul, thank you very much for joining us today. How are you doing?
Yeah, really good. And you?
Yeah, I'm quite under the weather, so I must apologise to everyone if I sound a bit blocked up. I can only apologise. I'm got a bit of a cold at the moment, but fortunately today, uh, I will mainly be listening, and Paul will be giving us all the interesting information. I mean, we might as well get started. Hopefully, more people will join as we go along. But to the people who are here, welcome. Today, we're going to be talking a bit more about what goes into the making the mechanics of Matchday. So you'll have seen that we have been talking about how we have some games coming up, and Paul has been working very closely with that. We put out a blog recently about this topic. It's the last thing we tweeted if you want to see it. So if it's okay with you, Paul, I think we'd just like to go through that with you if that's all good.
Yeah, all good.
Yeah, so we've got the current hypothesis in there. I don't know if you have it in front of you, but if you could just maybe explain a little bit more about what it is you were working on and what kind of things you're trying to learn and implement from it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as a bit of a stage setting, one of the first products we're launching at the moment, and that is partially available already on the website, is Matchday Squads. And Matchday Squads, in terms of experience, is going to allow you to build, of course, squads with the cars you've been collecting up to this point. And these squads then will be able to play matches against one another, automated simulated matches through a match engine that we've designed, and that we are going to continue to design iteratively. To start with this match engine, we've decided to start with two basic stats to model our footballers and how we're going to compare them and whether your team is good enough to beat the opponent team. And these two stats that we decided to start with, to stick to something very simple, were called up to this point attack and defense. And so, without entering too many specifics, basically, if you have a stronger attack than the opponent as a defensive stat, and when you have the ball, you have a stronger chance to score.
And we spoke a little bit recently about the fact that, say, like the physical and mental side of it is not being looked at in this instance, and you were telling me why that was and why that was not entering in at this point.
Yeah, so continuing our research from the starting point of having like attack and defense be our two first stats that we were modeling, we looked at various possibilities, different models, and we looked at, of course, how competitors have been modeling footballers up to this point. And when we try to gather data and model footballers using physical and psychological stats, they become really tricky to measure in a fair way, especially on the psychological side of things. Like it's
Yeah.
really hard to get any credible data on like your composure or your mental toughness or these kinds of stats that have been used in other football games to this point. So what we did essentially is try to look at it from another angle. And the angle we chose up to this point is to follow the four phases of play, which is an important concept in modern football, where the four phases of play are if you have the ball, you're attacking. If you lose the ball, you switch to defensive transition. Then you recover in defense. And then when you recover the ball, you move back to attacking transition and then attack again. So these four phases like flow in a natural loop, let's say. And they provide an interesting framework to model individual footballer performance using this kind of team level lens, I would say. So that's how we ended up using four stats that we are currently calling attack and defense as our two first stats, as I previously explained, and two new stats that we've introduced, which are called possession and pressing, that introduce another axis essentially. When we've started to look at how we would map footballer archetypes, let's say, across these four different stats, we realized that it was quite easy to pinpoint like very stereotypical, let's say, footballers, like someone who's really, really good at attacking but not much else, or someone who's really, really good at circulating the ball in possession or someone who's really, really good at defense or pressing. And we've been continuing to research that model. And we think that with four simple stats, we are managing to create something that is fairly accurate and authentic to the way football is played and allows us to have enough granularity to represent different footballer archetypes.
Great. Yeah. Okay. So now you've got these concepts and these attributes. I'm looking at the blog that we've put up, and I'm looking at natural oppositions. So you've got attack opposes defense, and pressing opposes possession. How does that sort of feed into what you're doing, and how is that sort of shaping you're moving this point forward?
So we always in game design, you're always interested in finding these kind of natural oppositions that are really easy to grasp from a player's perspective. I assume you know like rock, paper, scissors, or elemental relationships like fire, water, and these kind of things that are, for instance, heavily used in Pokemon, which is
Of
a kind
course,
of
of
a really,
course.
really big IP. So finding these natural positions for us allows us to create uh, tests, let's say stat tests that can compare two footballers. And because we have one vertical axis and one horizontal axis right now, we are able to compare footballers in different situations in a very simple way. For instance, pressing and possession for us, and again, this is still being researched, and we're gonna hopefully prove the model with the gameplay as we onboard players and start playtesting. But let's say opposing possession and pressing is interesting for us because it's really easy at a glance to understand one of these is with the ball, the other player is without the ball. So one is in possession and the other one is pressing. And then we can quickly compare who is better in their respective stat. If they are they like if let's say the player A is better at pressing than player B at possession, maybe naturally they will be taking the ball off of them. That's a very basic, simple test that we can do in the match engine to see if you manage to recover the ball or not, for instance.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm looking further down, and I've got all this. I've got to say, if you haven't seen the blog yet, please check it out because it is very interesting the way Paul's presented this. There's a lot of graphical representations of this. I can see now we've got on the ball versus off the ball. How is that sort of, it must be very difficult to sort of implement all this because I guess you have all these statistics information, but then you have to apply them to different scenarios as opposed to, like you said, when the player has the ball and the player doesn't have the ball.
Yeah, so like in being in and out of possession is a really core tenet of football. This is where a lot of the specifics of football happen. How your team plays off the ball, what kind of space they occupy, and so on and so forth, is enables a lot of depth and richness in the gameplay. And so naturally finding two clusters of stats that are leveraging either when you're off the ball or when you're on the ball, again, creates interesting and very simple oppositions that are, from a player's perspective, hopefully are going to be simple to understand and for us simple to leverage to create interesting situations. So let's say you're attacking with three attackers, three players, and you're in possession. Then on the other side, when someone is trying to defend, or they can look only as the two main stats that they care about, which is pressing or defense, and try to make an informed choice as to whether one of these is the best option for them, depending on the players they have in their hand and so on and so forth. And having these two clusters with just a simple model of four stats is interesting for us because we managed to keep a core concept of football, like being in possession or out of possession. Otherwise, it wouldn't really be a sports, a ball game without this concept. So who has the ball is super important in our games, and that enables it.
Absolutely, yeah. So to someone like me who is seeing all this information you've presented, and it looks very nice, but I don't really, we had a conversation that it's difficult to grasp if you're not maybe involved with it. What sort of benefits and uses of this data that you've now created have you been getting so far? I know you can't maybe go into details about game specifics and everything, but how has this sort of been shaping what you're doing when working on the game? And I guess how sort of how much has this helped you advance to the next stage of the process?
Well, this has been foundational for us because as we at Matchday start to roll out our game experiences, we have to come up with a model, right, to represent accurately or as authentically as possible each individual footballer in their specific strength and weaknesses. So having a simple yet granular enough way of representing that is key to any endeavor we have and we try to achieve. Any of the games we try to build will need to represent the footballers in some way or another, right? And to enable gameplay interactions and confrontations like conflict resolution on the pitch, whether that's at individual level when like two players are on a duel, on an aerial duel or a ground duel, we need a way to compare them and to say, okay, who is better or who has the most chance to progress or recover the ball and so on and so forth. So coming up with that initial model is one of the key steps for us to enable further gameplay developments. And that is true across the board, whether that's for squads or the mobile game or any other experience we're going to work on.
You mentioned there about representing the players and trying to get a realistic representation. How difficult is it, and how do you sort of approach accounting for things? You know, because obviously in football anything can happen. You know, sometimes the underdog will win or something like that. How do you? Is that something that you have to factor in as well? And how do you approach that challenge?
Yeah, exactly. We can't rely on stats only. Like if we were to rely on stats only, the game would essentially become sort of, I don't like to say that word, but that would potentially become pay to win because if you manage to grind your way or pay your way up to having the best cards in all positions and you're purely using deterministic conflict resolution, then, you know, every time there is an opposition between a stronger stat and a weaker stat, the stronger stat would win. We know that in football and many other sports, but especially in football, the unexpected happens regularly, often, and in unpredictable ways. So that needs to be factored into the conflict resolution system in the gameplay. When you play, even if you have Messi and your Messi is attacking someone's fullback, for instance, on the wing, there is a chance that the fullback, you know, overcome the odds and recovers the ball from Messi and launches a counter attack that ends up in a goal, even if your team is weaker on paper. The balance is where you know, it gets tricky because we don't want to make it unauthentic and have like teams that constantly win every time, but we also don't want to have like weaker team that overcome the odds all the time as well. So how deterministic or how much, you know, random or surprise we add to the simulation is where the design is gets really tricky and also really interesting. There's a lot more to the game than just these four stats, but these four stats are what we need to start and to enable all of what comes after. And it's been a fascinating area to research because in recent years there's been a lot of new research from different sources to model footballers in different ways. So you know, if you look at football analytics spaces like on Twitter or like on the Athletic or any blog or website that represents footballers through data and charts, there are more and more and more models coming every year that allow you to look at footballers in different ways. And you know, our model for us and what we try to achieve feels like something that is manageable for football fans who may not be like super hardcore gamers, to yeah, to keep it accessible.
Yeah, definitely. I was going to touch on that because we want to make this something that everyone can play and everyone can pick up and join in with. You, Paul, hope you don't mind me mentioning, I've previously worked on Football Manager, which is obviously a lot more intense and a lot more tactical and that kind of thing. How, what would you? How would you say? Um, the biggest differences are? I mean, it sounds like a daft question, but in terms of the working process, when you have like sort of Football Manager and you have all those statistics, how does that come? How does now what you're doing now compare to that when you're trying to have a sort of more straightforward basis of working?
So I think the common, let's say, points between something very involved and very detailed and rich as Football Manager and what we are trying to do, which is to provide more accessible football experiences to a broader set of football fans, is that it needs to feel authentic. It needs to be really, really respectful of football and tap into that DNA. As football fans, we all know what feels distinctly football and what doesn't. And I think, having worked at Sports Interactive before on Football Manager, that's something they really, really care about. And that's what we also really care about on a, on a deep level. How do we, no matter the level of complexity or depth or whatever, how do we represent football in an authentic way a similar question in both products. Of course, in Football Manager's case, you have a lot of data and statistics, and the models are increasingly more complex than what we're trying to do right now. But in the end, the question is the same. Does it feel like football or not? On in Football Manager, there are like more than 18 visible attributes. I think there are around 18 visible attributes on a footballer profile. This is a lot of granularity and details. And for someone who's more casually interested in football and has not a strong, gaming experience, this is overwhelming. You cannot really compare two footballers really easily if you don't have that deeper knowledge and that time or commitment just to look at all the stats and so on and so forth. So what we're trying to do on our side is to provide something that is much more high level and much easier to grasp at a base level. But then, of course, what we want to achieve is then, if you're really into the game that we're proposing and the experience that we are offering you, and to increase the depth progressively, so that if you start looking for more details, you will notice that we don't have just four stats, but we have other layers that come on top of that and form a richer model. So that if you really have more football knowledge, more football interest, and a bit more of a gaming experience and background, then you can maybe leverage these upper layers to perform better, for instance.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Now on this question, feel free to shoot me down because it might not be something that you've got to yet. Again, apologies for my voice. I've got a cold, everyone. But we recently put out a question on Discord and Twitter about so the Matchday cards have different rarities. You know, you've got common, limited, rare, legendary, unique. And the question we put out was, should a card, maybe say you had a Premier League player and a League Two player, should the Premier League player always beat the League Two player regardless of their rarities because it's a higher level player? Or if, for example, the Premier League player was a common card and the League Two player was a legendary card, should the League Two player be able to win because of the higher rarity? Is this something you've had to start thinking about to factor in, or is that still to come?
So we are currently working on this topic, which is a really important one for us to figure out and manage. At this stage, our hypothesis is that rarity shouldn't give you an overwhelmingly important advantage. So let's say you have two Messis of different rarities. The rarer Messi shouldn't be much better, because if they are based on the same stat block, let's say, so the four stats having similar values, we're not looking to create across the rarity scale a massive difference in power, in root power in these core stats. However, what we're looking at right now is how does rarity affect indirectly performance and give you like indirect boosts. For instance, and I'm not saying this is what we're gonna do, I'm just giving you an example. For instance, let's say we have a stamina concept in the game, and like if you play the same team over and over, they will get increasingly tired, after each match. Maybe the higher rarity card will get tired less quickly, or maybe they will recover stamina faster. but that would not impact directly their core stats and their core value in the gameplay. So inherently, Rare or Messi wouldn't perform 10 times better, let's say. But they would have a lot of little like indirect advantages that would make them more worthwhile to own and to use in your team.
Mm.
But that just wouldn't make it automatically so much better that you have if you have a the same team in common as someone has like all of the legendary versions. The legendary version shouldn't win every time. Again, we go back to the unpredictability and somewhat fairness of football. Everything can happen, so that needs to be factored in across rarity levels.
Yeah, and I guess it's similar to what you were saying before about how it doesn't want to turn into a pay to win. And if we just have someone not necessarily, you don't want to have someone just winning every game because they have the highest rarity of cards. We want this to be something that everyone can to join in and play with. Right, somebody, Michael has his hand up. I'm guessing that might be to ask a question. So, Michael Samuel, I'm going to allow you to speak. Hello, Michael. Can you hear me? He's connecting currently. Very exciting. Hello, Michael. Michael Samuel, can you? Oh, he's muted him. Do you want to turn your mic on if you wanted to ask a question? Nope.
No, no, no.
Okay, sorry about that. I just wasn't sure if you wanted to speak. Okay, so coming back to you then, Paul, in terms of where things are at the moment, and obviously things change very frequently and everything like that. But now that you've sort of created this framework, where do you go from here? What's sort of the next step, without going into detail, if you can't, what's sort of the next step where you need to go from here to try and implement that as part of the game, and what would follow on from that?
So now that we have like a first hypothesis of a statistical model that feels simple enough to use for our games, now we're building interactions that leverage these stats. So as I mentioned previously, if your attacker is trying to dribble on the wing to cut inside, which stat are they going to use? Are they going to use a single stat or a combination of two stats? And how are we going to compare them to the defender who's trying to get the ball from them? And how does the player interact with that? How do you instruct your attacker to maybe move on the wing, or how do we instruct your defense to move in certain ways or to act in certain ways? So that's the layer that we're adding on top of this statistical model is, okay, what kind of actions does the player do, and what the player as the person who plays the game, because unfortunately in football games when you say player, it could be the person who plays the game or the actual footballers. So what does the player, the gamer, actually does in the game, and then how do the footballers respond, and how does that leverage the statistical model? So that's the stage we are at right now, and we are actively prototyping gameplay features, gameplay mechanics, and rules so that we make a very enjoyable experience.
Again, I don't want to, like, without going into detail, have you been able to sort of like have eyes on these prototypes and have a chance to experience how they look and how they feel?
Yeah, we're still in very early stage at the moment, but this is looking very promising. We are excited about what we're building. Of course, everything will be revealed in due time.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
But
stress.
yeah, the basics for us is right now, if I can just share that, is we have been allowing the community to collect cards. Cards
Mm-hmm.
are a game entity. I think it would be weird that we allow people to collect cards and then in the gameplay use something completely different. So what we're trying to do right now is apply this statistical model on our game cards and allow people to use them to simulate a football match. That is a really broad framework that could mean a lot of different things, and these are the many different things we're exploring right now.
And you mentioned the other day that, like, this is sort of a very early stage, and I guess there is still quite a lot of stuff that needs to go into. So it's a very complicated process, right? If I've got that correct.
Yeah, and especially because we're trying to do something that feels very accessible in the early stages, and then of course, as I mentioned, if you're really into it and you want to strategize more, you're gonna have that richness in behind. But basically, as a first layer, it needs to be extremely accessible, and this is much harder to do than complexity, especially in games design. In games design, often it's really easy to add more systems, to add more stats, to add more layers like skills, perks, traits, attributes, whatever you want. Keeping it super simple and yet maintaining a semblance of strategy and interest and fun is in my opinion and in my experience the hardest part of the job. Once we manage to really nail that part, then expanding it will be much easier for us.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like, just as a basic sentence, it sounds like a very, very difficult task. Keeping it realistic and engage, involved, but not too much so.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I mean, how have you practically? How are you finding that as a challenge when you've actually been working on it? Is that something that you feel like you're edging towards it, or is that again like a very? I mean, you've said there that like that's the point that you need to crack.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you Brits say, the proof is in the pudding, right? I'm not sure I
Good.
ever understood that idiom, but I think I'm using it correctly,
You are, you
hopefully.
are.
Yeah. So in the end, it will be, it will be a success for us if we roll out a playable experience that people enjoy, not
Mhm.
just us, but the broader community, because that's the people we want to entertain with our games in the end, not just ourselves, but the community. And that's when we'll know if we have succeeded or not. At the moment, I can tell you I feel confident about the stuff we're building, and that we think we have achieved a good balance of accessibility and richness. But again, that will be proven with the community once they have the playable in their hands. I cannot really say myself at this stage if this is going to be a success or not.
No, but I think that's a very fair way to put it. But it's good, very good to hear. That you're confident in it. It's looking good from our side. I'm sure that it'll be really interesting when our users have the opportunity to see that, to hear their feedback and see what they think. I think that's pretty much everything that we had to discuss. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add at all, Paul, that I didn't pick up on them. Something that I didn't ask about that you were particularly keen to mention.
No, I think we've covered everything that we wanted to cover in this AMA. Of
Mm.
course, we'll have many more to come, and with more details and more layers to discuss. Right now, it's the very first layer of the games we're gonna build. So if that feels a bit abstract, we'll have to come back later with more layers to make it a bit more concrete, I think.
You have a very poetic way of speaking about these things, Paul. I mean, between that, what you've just said, and the proof is in the pudding. It's beautiful to listen to. And you're I think the first, other than our co-founders, you're the first Matchday employee to do two of these AMAs. So a very big thank you to you for joining us. It's always interesting, and I would urge everyone. It was the last thing we tweeted. It's on our. If you go to matchday.com news and check out the Making the Mechanics of Matchday blog, there's some very interesting stuff in there from Paul, and we'll add this audio to it as well, so you can hear more about what he was talking. But yeah, I think that pretty much sums it up. So thank you very much again to you, Paul, for joining us.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Great. And yeah, thank you to everyone who joined us, and keep an eye out for our next one. Cheers, guys. Bye bye.
Bye.